How beautiful they are, the lordly ones, who dwell in the hills, in the hollow hills. They have faces like flowers, and their breath is a wind that blows over summer meadows filled with dewy clover. Their limbs are more white than shafts of moonshine. They are more fleet than the March wind. They laugh and are glad and are terrible. When their lances shake and glitter, every green reed quivers. How beautiful they are. How beautiful, the lordly ones in the hollow hills. Isaac Hart presents Ghost in the Museum. Episode 9. They have faces like flowers. The attacks, when they came, were always a horror to behold. Tressa had imagined once that, as distressing as Rachel's episodes were, that in all the years since their daughter's diagnosis, that she and Harry would have had a firmer grasp on what to do when they struck, or that they would be any easier to bear looking at. This had not been how it had played out in the slightest. She still felt her stomach churn, the bile rising in her throat as she struggled to hold on to Rachel as she thrashed and writhed and tore at her eyes, screaming, "He's here!" Rachel shrieked, her face contorted in terror, eyes wild and white and boggling as she gazed dumbstruck at the corner of the bedroom. "No! No! Oh God, he's here! Oh God!" Tressa held Rachel as tightly as she could, ducking the tearing, scratching fingers, feeling her buckle as she tried to kick away whatever imagined demon was tormenting her today. "It's all right, darling," Tressa breathed, running her hands through Rachel's ragged blonde hair, doing anything she could think of to calm her. "He's not gonna hurt you. He's not there. You're so brave, darling. You're my brave girl. It'll all be over soon." As much as Tressa had tried to insist to Rachel that her hallucinations weren't real, that whatever she could see couldn't hurt her, it never did any good and only distressed her to the point that she was inconsolable after the psychotic episode abated. Tressa was sure she did it for her own peace of mind, more so than Rachel's. All she could do was hold her daughter close and comfort her best she could until the nightmare subsided. She could hear Harry crashing about downstairs in the house, pulling open drawers with a scrape and a rattle as he cursed. It was always the way. The pills were never there when they needed them. No matter where they left them, no matter how obvious the drawer, whenever Rachel was being torn apart by paroxysms of terror, there would be no antipsychotics to hand, only for them to turn up after a desperate search in an out-of-the-way cupboard or down the back of a couch, as if they had been maliciously, deliberately moved. Tressa prayed silently that Harry would find a mislaid bottle, just a few spare pills. If he had to sprint off to the pharmacy again to pick them up, she would be stuck on the floor with Rachel for at least another half hour, and she could feel her strength flagging as it was. There was nothing more frightening to Tressa than being trapped in a room with her daughter in a fit of delusional behaviour. She was just as liable to injure herself than her mother. Rachel was in tears, screwing up her eyes as tight as she could. Just make it, just, God, make him, just, he's gone, oh God, just, oh God, stop, lives in the hills, lives in the watching, laughing, God. Tressa clung to Rachel even tighter and buried her head in her hair, tears stinging her own eyes. The string of nonsense that poured out of Rachel in her fits was heartbreaking. She could remember her first word, her first day at school, when even the vividness of her imagination that drove her to converse with the imaginary friends at the bottom of their garden gave her and Harry no inkling as to the depths of the mental disturbance that would overtake her. "It's okay, baby," Tressa sobbed, pulling Rachel into her chest. "It's going to be okay. My beautiful girl, you're so brave." She didn't know who she was saying the words to anymore, or who they were meant to make feel better. The door to the bedroom burst open and Harry dashed in, breathless, sweat glinting off his balding head as he sunk to the floor by Rachel. "I got them," he gasped, producing the small orange vial from his shaking hand, which he was just as quick to snap shut to prevent one of Rachel's swinging limbs from knocking the last few precious pills into the far corners of the room. There were no words that needed to be exchanged between him and Tressa. This action was as familiar to them as it was dreadful. Harry wrapped his arms around Rachel, whose limbs were now shaking at her sides, eyes rolling back in her head as she gasped and shuddered. "You're nearly there, Pixie," Harry whispered, rocking Rachel back and forth. "You're nearly at the other side. Mummy's got your medicine. They'll all go away once you take it." Rachel hardly seemed to notice as Tressa slipped the small white pill into her mouth and massaged her throat. Froth bubbled up from the corners of her mouth, her back arching and cracking with each agonised spasm. "Beautiful!" she gasped, eyes spinning around the room in a daze. "How beautiful!" With a final, terrible shudder, Rachel went limp, her head lolling miserably onto her father's shoulder, her chest rising and falling as she panted like a blown horse. The three sat there in breathless silence for a long time before anyone said anything at all. The weather in Cobham was, as it always seemed to Tressa, unnaturally pleasant. She had lived in a few other places in her life. A career spent authenticating art for museums had never lent itself to stability, and yet none of them were ever so fine in late April. A warm breeze blew gently down the street as Tressa made her way to the small cluster of shops in the village. That was another aspect of the place that had at first tickled her when she and Harry had moved back to his home village some 2 decades earlier, but now felt near suffocating in its tweeness. That the one and only street in Cobham should be called simply the street. There was so little that was unpleasant about the place that it seemed almost insulting to Tressa as she passed the white-painted cottages with their blackwood beams. Who could possibly feel miserable and ill at ease in picture postcard Kent? Tressa sank onto the park bench on the village green, the wide stretch of meticulously tended grass, stretching from the church of St. Mary Magdalene to the Leather Bottle, the village pub with its wooden benches shading under sun-bleached parasols. She kneaded her temples, staring down at her feet as she steadied her breathing, her brain howling in misery as the realities of her situation settled upon her with a crushing certainty. Why was it that she should be so blindsided by things that were obvious? Of course, the street was called The Street. Cobham was so remote that there were hardly any other streets within 10 miles to confuse it with. Of course, she was feeling miserable. She was marooned in a village far away from anyone and everyone she knew. Of course, Rachel had schizophrenia. What did she think was going to happen? She only had herself to blame. Tressa knew that much. When she and Harry had got together, it had seemed like a fairy tale. The two of them had been working together at the Tate Britain, had bonded over their love of art, a half-giggled disdain for the modernism of their sister gallery across the Thames, matched with the sentimentality for the romantic pieces of the 19th century. It was the turn of the millennium then. The reek of possibility swirled everywhere. She blamed Tony Blair and Oasis and all those last vestiges of national cool that grew more facile with distance. She was young, ambitious, and fresh out of university. Harry was clever, kind, a widower with grown-up sons her own age. Engaged after 3 months, married after a year. It had all seemed so simple and so easy then. What had she cared for what her parents thought when she'd introduced the older man? What thought had Harry given to Patrick and Anthony when he had foisted a young stepmother upon them? The truth was, they hadn't thought of anyone else at all, and certainly hadn't when Rachel was born. They had been so happy then. Harry had always wanted a daughter, and he had doted on her and Tressa. She could still muster a smile as she thought of those shimmering sunshine memories, raising their little girl in Harry's childhood home in Cobham, inherited from his elderly parents and lovingly restored by them both. It was perfect for them, then. The commute to work from Gravesend to London was worth it for the gorgeous surroundings, the large, beautiful garden, full of nooks and crannies and backing onto the thick, swaying woods. She and Rachel had painted and made clay pots and thrown glitter and pasta shapes onto glue-pasted paper sheets. Rachel had giggled and danced and bounced off furniture in a pink tutu and a set of wire-framed fairy wings. It all seemed so distant, like the fading of a dream. The wind coming down the street blew suddenly colder, and Tressa felt the hairs on her bare legs stand up with a shock that made her start. She gripped her arms close to herself, rocked back and forth as she struggled to compose her emotions. The decline had been like a bankruptcy, slowly and then all at once. The imaginary friends that Rachel would play with in the garden began to follow her inside the house. It had been amusing at first, the earnestness with which the girl had insisted that the frenzied crayon scribblings on the walls were not done by her own hand. "The fairies, Mummy!" she would wail, distress spreading across her face at the disbelief she was met with. "The naughty fairies did it!" The smiles had been slow to fade, but had slipped away by the time Rachel had begun acting out at school. She was irritable, avoided her friends, spent whole lessons doodling in her textbooks, and then descended into frenzies of rage when reprimanded by the teachers. Detentions had no effect, and scoldings at home liable to cause her to storm off to her room. The little girl had seemed to stretch and slump, and a callow, surly young woman with hollow eyes and a scowling face took her place. She had hacked her hair haphazardly short, picked fights with strangers on nights out. The misery and embarrassment Tressa had felt as she'd sat in the police station, aghast to hear that Rachel had cracked a man's skull with her motorcycle helmet when he'd looked at her in a way she hadn't cared for. She'd been lucky to get away with the fine, but that was the end of her time at college. Rachel had dropped out barely halfway through her first term. She disappeared for the first time not long afterwards. How many sleepless nights had there been, where Harry had driven the streets of Gravesend looking for her, or where Tressa had called the mothers of old school friends on the off chance that their pixie was to be found with them. And then Rachel would reappear with a crash through the kitchen window in the early morning, and they'd come downstairs to find her covered in scratches she couldn't explain, talking so fast that her words descended into gibberish. "Don't tell me you can't see him!" She'd roar at them as she crashed about the dining room, eyes darting about in terror. "Don't you tell me that! He's there! He's right there!" It was the night they'd found Rachel with the kitchen knife, crouched in the bath and staring straight through their chests like they were invisible, that Tressa and Harry had finally been able to have an ambulance take her away. They'd sat stock still in the doctor's office as she'd told them the diagnosis. They should have known, of course. The older the father, the greater the risk of psychiatric issues in the child. The thought had always been there at the back of their mind, as they had wept and strained over what had overcome the happy, bright-faced girl they had once known. And yet when it was confirmed in its obviousness, it was all the more dreadful. The truth of it had sunk Harry, ruined him, and it was then that his age had truly set in for Tressa. The hair suddenly grey and lank, the eyes and easy smile collapsed under wrinkles. Rachel had come home with them after the long weeks spent by her bedside, nudging the flashes of lucidity that occasionally bubbled up now she was on her antipsychotics. Lockdown had smothered everything less than a month later, and the three of them were trapped in the house. That year had been hell. Hell for Rachel, as the medicine she needed to unmuddle her thoughts and keep her hallucinations at bay dried up. Hell for Harry, his health deteriorating too. Hell for Tressa, who watched her family wilt like a dying plant during that unnaturally warm and shimmering spring. Watched as Rachel stared for hours out the kitchen window to the bottom of the garden and the tall dark trees where she had once frolicked with the fairies. "Stop," she had seethed to herself repeatedly. "Stop looking at us." The stakes had dwindled once restrictions had been eased, but her and Harry both knew, and Rachel too in her lucid moments, that the stress of it all had left them broken. The house was quiet now, and worn, and faded, the three of them trudging mechanically through their motions. Harry tinkered in his shed. She drove to and from the Tate precisely an hour and 13 minutes each way. Rachel had her once-a-week video call with her psychiatrist. Cobham was far too rural for one to drive out to the house in person. Otherwise, she would be slumped in her chair, disinterested and dishevelled. The silent acknowledgement between herself and Harry that this was as close to better as their girl would ever get was immiserating. "Ah, Tressa!" said the high, reedy voice suddenly next to her ear. "What luck?" Tressa started and composed herself as quickly as she could as she turned to see the owner of the voice. Again, she shouldn't have been so surprised by something so obvious. Mrs. Gullis was hovering a few feet away, looking as willowy and careworn as she had been the day she'd introduced herself in almost the same manner some 20 years earlier, almost as soon as her and Harry had moved into the village. Mrs. Gullis was one of those people who seemed to have been the same age forever. Even Harry, who Tressa was reasonably sure had told her that he had been at school with her, had also commented that even then she had worn the thick, wire-rimmed spectacles, her wild auburn hair scraped back, bangles swinging at her wrists. Tressa wasn't completely sure, even now, what her name was. It was either Caroline or Clementine, and after this long it was too mortifying to have to ask. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Gullis," Tressa blurted out, sounding far too cheerful to be believable. "How have you been? We've not seen you in a long while." Tressa forced a smile as Mrs. Gullis rambled on about her mundane activities, listing off chores that seemed to blur together into a tedious monotony. She struggled to maintain interest, her mind still weighed down by the heaviness of her own thoughts. "And you could hardly move for all the spiders! Oh, but enough about me, how are you?" Mrs. Gullis finally paused long enough to ask. "You look a little down in the dumps." "I'm fine," Tressa instinctively replied, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Mrs. Gullis seemed to accept the response, her attention quickly refocusing on her own agenda. "Oh, it's lucky I bumped into you," she explained. "I was on my way over to your house." Tressa grimaced. Mrs. Gullis had a habit of showing up unannounced. The invention of the phone seemed to have passed her by. "My son Adrian, he's doing ever so well over in Dubai these days. Well, he's been round, and he's been sorting through my attic," she elaborated. "The boy will insist on not letting me up on the ladder these days, must go rooting around up there by himself. In any case, he stumbled upon some old painting tucked away in the walls. Now, I'd never seen it before, not a clue where it's come from, but he believed it might hold some value. And, well, this is your sort of thing, so I wondered whether you could appraise the thing for me, if you're not too busy, of course." Tressa hesitated for a moment, considering the request. Working at the Tate had once been her passion, but that flame had long since dimmed. Still, she owed Mrs. Gullis a debt of gratitude for her past kindness towards her family. She'd babysat Rachel when she was young, and had never been anything but hospitable, to a fault at times. Besides, she had no other plans for the day. Her aimless walk had merely been an attempt to escape the stale, suffocating atmosphere of her home, if only for an hour or so. "Oh, well," Tressa let out a resigned sigh. "I suppose I can come and give it a quick look." The old woman's face lit up with delight, her gratitude evident in the warmth of her expression. "Marvellous!" she exclaimed, turning on her heels and ambling slowly off in the direction of the cottage. "You are a dear, Tressa. There'll be a custard cream in it for you too." Tressa followed slowly after her, the knot of dread still lingering in her stomach. She cast her eye back on the village green as she left. It really was unnaturally bright today. Tressa followed Mrs. Gullis into the cluttered cottage, her steps careful and cautious as she ducked under the low doorway. The quaint exterior of the 17th century wood beam and thatched roof construction belied the chaotic mess within. Every surface was covered with old bric-a-brac, books and miscellaneous objects, creating a maze-like path through the narrow interior. Despite her petite frame, Tressa found herself crouching to avoid hitting her head on the low ceiling, gingerly picking her way through the piles of clutter to avoid toppling over anything. Meanwhile, Mrs. Gullis's stream of chatter continued unabated, her voice filling the cramped space as she regaled Tressa about the painting. "It really is a remarkable piece. Darling Adrian looked pale as a ghost when he brought it down from the attic. I asked him, whatever is the matter? My word, I nearly spat out my tea when I first laid my eyes on it. What a ghastly thing, I said. Where did you find something so horrid? In the attic, he says, in the furthest, darkest corner, facing the wall. Could have sworn it wasn't there the day before. It must have been my late husband's, I thought. Oscar had such a penchant for holding on to oddities." Tressa couldn't help but find Mrs. Gullis's last comment ironic, given the cluttered state of her own home. Nevertheless, she followed the older woman's lead, navigating through the maze of possessions until she reached the dining room. There, on the dining table, lay the square shape of a picture frame, concealed beneath a heavy sackcloth. Tressa froze momentarily in the doorframe. She stared at the shape for a long while. She was used to seeing paintings in such a state. The museum stores of the Tate were full of the blue metal trolleys loaded with such frames, covered in the durable fabric to stop them scraping together as they were transported to the galleries for hanging. But there was something undeniably unsettling about the lone mass on the table, a blank square staring up at the ceiling. Curiosity was piqued. "Is this it? Why have you got it covered up?" she asked, trying not to sound too invested. The last thing she wanted was to fully engage with Mrs. Gullis. The woman could talk for England, and she ran the very real risk of being declared a missing person for the amount of time it would take her to extricate herself from the conversation. Mrs. Gullis was already shuffling away to tend to the kettle on the stove. "Oh, the thing was already wrapped in it. Probably to stop it gathering dust," she offered nonchalantly. "Mind you, I did have such an odd sensation when I peeled it back the first time. Now, if ever there was a painting you could say looked back at you." A chill ran down Tressa's spine, the air in the room suddenly feeling thick and muffled. Her hands danced over the sackcloth. Rachel's words during lockdown, as she stared off into the tree line beyond the garden, bounced off the edge of her mind for just a moment. Stop looking at us." Tressa shook her head, trying to clear it. She was clearly far too stressed, and any good the walk had done her earlier had been thoroughly undone by Mrs. Gullis's incessant chattering about the unseen painting. She might as well get it over with and tell her how many pence the likely ragged old daubing of a Kentish portraitist was worth. Pushing aside the lingering foreboding that had briefly settled on her, with the practiced hand of an expert, she gently pulled back the cover to reveal the contents of the frame beneath. She was met with a sight that seemed to freeze her in her place. Wide-eyed, she stared at the painting below, feeling as though her brain was boiling and fizzing, unable to fully comprehend what lay before her. Chipped and fading with age, the canvas depicted a lush forest clearing, illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the towering trees. The scene was alive with wild, untamed plants, casting eerie shadows across the ground below. At the centre of the clearing rose a rounded hump, adorned with delicate flowers, bluebells, daisies, forget-me-nots, blooming in vibrant hues. But it was the figures dancing around the hump that sent the electrostatic waves of dread down Tressa's spine, the signals firing from her brain screaming at her to run, to flee the cottage in blind, animalistic panic. Tiny, delicate beings with wings and elfin faces twisted in glee, their forms illuminated by the shafts of moonlight. And at the heart of the revelry, perched atop the hump like a throne, loomed a figure so ghastly that Tressa had to repress the urge to scream. It was not quite animal, but not quite vegetable either. Long, sinewy stalks formed its limbs, while a bulbous torso teemed with flowers. But it was the face that filled Tressa with dread. A seething mass of petals and seeds, collapsing into a dark chasm of a mouth lined with razor-sharp teeth, the whole of the painting seeming to collapse towards its bottomless, eyeless face. Something about it was grotesque, almost obscene, and Tressa found herself unable to tear her gaze away. Mrs. Gullis's clattering footsteps broke the spell, and Tressa blinked in confusion as the older woman returned with the tea. "See? What a ghastly thing!" she crowed, setting down Tressa's cup next to her on the table with a clink. "That's certainly not what fairy kings looked like when I was a girl." Tressa's mouth moved up and down wordlessly for a moment, finally tearing her eyes away from the painting to look at Mrs. Gullis in uncomprehending bewilderment. "Huh?" she muttered, the words drying up in her mouth like she had just awoken from the deepest of sleeps. Mrs. Gullis again seemed not to register Tressa's extreme disquiet about the painting. She gestured to the figures at the edges of the canvas. "Well, this is clearly a fairy circle," she mused. "My mother always used to tell me the fae folk would go dancing in the light of a full moon, and if you ever glimpsed them dancing, they'd vanish forever, and you'd surely die within the week. One of those silly old stories parents tell their children to get them to stay in bed. And if this is one of those fairy dances, well, this monstrous-looking fellow must be their king or their god." Tressa looked back at the painting, her eyes drawn to the squatting, flower-faced lord, his face blooming over the cavorting fairies like a psychedelic master of ceremonies. If he was a god, thought Tressa, then he was truly great and terrible to behold, awe-inspiring in the literal sense of the word. There was a primal part of Tressa's brain that made her want to bow before it. "Beautiful," she whispered, surprising even herself. "How beautiful." Mrs. Gullis snorted derisively. "If you say so, dear," she sniffed. "You are the expert on this sort of thing." Mrs. Gullis's question pulled Tressa back to the present, prompting her to shift her focus from the unsettling subject matter of the painting to its artistic merit. She took a deep breath, marshalling the rational part of her brain as she studied the work before her. It's mid-19th century? From the English school?" Tressa began, her voice steady as she analysed the painting. "The detail is incredibly fine, almost microscopic. Must have taken a considerable amount of time to paint it in all the intricate details." As she spoke, a flicker of recognition sparked in Tressa's mind, and suddenly it dawned on her. Her memory flashed to a painting she passed almost every day at the Tate. The Fairy Feller's Master Stroke by Richard Dadd. The similarities were uncanny. The intricate, layered scenery, the grotesque figures teeming in the undergrowth. A jolt of excitement ran through Tressa, her pulse quickening with the thrill of discovery. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in years, reminiscent of the early days at the museum, when every new acquisition held the promise of uncovering hidden connections and secrets. She recalled the happy memories of those days with Harry, looking at that very painting together, of flicking through books of fantastical pre-Raphaelite paintings with Rachel as she cooed. "So, is it worth anything?" Mrs. Gullis asked expectantly. Tressa hesitated for a moment, the weight of her next words heavy on her tongue. "I'm, not sure," she replied, though she knew it was a lie. If the painting truly was an original work by Richard Dadd, it would be a significant acquisition for any museum, let alone the Tate. Tressa summoned up her courage, hitherto unknown reserves of which seemed to have bubbled to the surface. "It might be of some interest," she conceded, trying to sound unconvinced. "I have reference materials at home in my office. You wouldn't mind, would you, if I brought this back to the house for further research? I'd bring it straight back, of course." Mrs. Gullis raised a quizzical eyebrow, but to Tressa's relief she readily agreed. "Well, be my guest," she said as she sipped her tea. "I want rid of it, whether I get anything for it or not. I just can't abide the wretched thing in my house." With a sense of disbelief at what she was doing, Tressa carefully covered the painting in its sackcloth and bundled it under her arm. She hurriedly drank the rest of her tea, her hand trembling slightly as she struggled to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. What was she doing? The thought gnawed at her, a nagging voice of doubt in the back of her mind. She couldn't help but feel a sense of kinship with Rachel in moments like this, overtaken by sudden impulses and notions that seemed beyond her grasp. Could she really be capable of cheating an old friend out of something so valuable? The idea seemed absurd, and yet here she was, clutching the dreadful painting under her arm, intent on scuttling away with it. Well, I've got to be off, Tressa said abruptly, not quite meeting the older woman in the eye. Need to get back home soon. Harry's been looking after Rachel all afternoon now, and he could do with a break. Mrs. Gullis's eyes filled with sympathy. Oh, of course, dear, she sighed, placing a reassuring hand on Tressa's arm. How is your darling girl? I do hope she's on the up. Tressa felt a pang of shame deep within her as she lied through her teeth for the second time that day. Oh, she's fine, she mumbled. Getting better. She knew it was far from the truth. Rachel had never been more disconnected from the world around her, lost in a haze of hallucinations and delusions. Most days she seemed unaware that her and Harry were even there. But Mrs. Gullis smiled warmly. That's wonderful, she said, her eyes swelling with reminiscence. For all her troubles, she couldn't have been blessed with two more wonderful parents. You do a marvellous job for her, you really do, and she is such a bright spark. The older woman paused before turning to look out of the kitchen window. Mrs. Gullis's cottage backed onto the woods too, the same one as Tressa and Harry's house. The trees were swaying now, the wind picking up into a stiff and groaning torrent. I really am dreadfully fond of her, Tressa, Mrs. Gullis said gently. You know, it really is ever so funny how we should find this painting in this house. When I would look after Rachel when she was little, I'd tell her all the fairy tales my mother told me about the fae folk. Whimsical tales, you know, but she was ever so captivated by them. How the little people move objects around in the house, or add things that have never been there before, just to cause mischief. Why, Rachel ran off from me during a walk in the woods one time, and when she came back, she told me that she'd even seen them dancing around Hollow Hill. It was Mrs. Gullis's laughter that haunted Tressa, as she ducked out the front door, hasty goodbyes made, her heart heavy with the weight of her deception. As she stepped out of the cluttered cottage and onto the street, Tressa's thoughts drifted back to Rachel, to the tree she stared at, lost in her own world. She gripped the lump and shape of the painting tighter under her arm, the weight of it pressing against her chest. This was stress, Tressa told herself, a desperate attempt to break free from the suffocating monotony of her life. Not long ago she was sat in the village green, head in her hands over how bad things had gotten with Rachel and Harry, how trapped she felt. Maybe it was madness, she thought, a desperate bid to inject some magic back into her world. Away with the fairies, you are, Tressa muttered to herself as the wind blew hard against her back, and the first black clouds began to drift in front of the setting sun. Tressa could feel the weight of exhaustion settle upon her shoulders as she stood outside the house and took in its tired appearance. The once charming semi-detached terrace now looked shabbier than she would have liked, the ivy clinging to the white painted wooden slats, brown and wilted, the paint chipping away in neglected patches. She sighed to herself, her gaze lingering on the worn exterior. She and Harry had poured their hearts into restoring the place after they moved in, and for a while it had blossomed into one of those homes she would daydream about in magazines. But they had been outpaced by repairs during lockdown, and 4 years later they still hadn't caught up. The decline of their home seemed to mirror Rachel's own struggles, and Tressa couldn't shake the feeling that it was a heavy-handed metaphor for her daughter's mental disquiet. She climbed the stairs and made her way through the overgrown front garden, the manicured lawn now overrun with dandelions. Harry's back problems and her relentless commuting left little time for upkeep, and Rachel was the last person they could trust with a lawnmower. Struggling against the force of the wind threatening to slam the door shut behind her, Tressa finally entered the house to find Harry shuffling about for his coat, a flat cap perched on his head. Relief flooded his face as he spotted Tressa. "Ah, there you are," he exclaimed, a smile breaking out across his face. "I was just about to go out and look for you." Tressa dragged her hands through her wind-tangled hair. "Sorry I'm late," she said. "Bumped into Mrs. Gullis on the green." That earned an amused eye roll from Harry. "Of course," he grimaced, a gesture that never failed to make Tressa smile. "There's always the danger of running into her in this place. I swear, she waits in the bushes and jumps out. Caroline could bring an army to a halt the amount of time she talks." Harry glanced down at the square shape of the painting still clutched in its sackcloth under Tressa's arm. "Her latest donation to us, I presume," he said wryly. This caused Tressa to glance down at the painting in her arms, her mind racing to concoct a plausible explanation. She was clearing out her house," she stammered, not quite meeting her husband in the eye. "She didn't like it, so thought we might like it. Mid-19th century local artist." Tressa knew it was yet another lie. Why couldn't she bring herself to tell the truth about this thing? It was like the painting compelled her to obfuscate in its service, anything to bring it into the house, away from any other eyes but her own. Harry looked at her quizzically as he hung up his coat, but before he could press the matter, Tressa deftly changed the subject. "How's Rachel?" she asked, looking about for their daughter. A heavy silence settled between them as Harry sighed sadly and glanced at his shoes. "Where she was when you left," he sighed, rubbing the back of his head. "In the conservatory, painting. She's not in a talking mood today." Tressa's heart sank at the thought. All she wanted was for Rachel to have a semblance of an ordinary life. But the antipsychotics that kept her hallucinations at bay also dulled her senses to the point of near immobility. It was a cruel dichotomy, leaving Tressa feeling helpless and torn between the extremes of Rachel's existence. She pulled Harry into a one-armed hug, the painting still hanging at her side. "I'll go and talk to her. You get the fire going in here." Harry gave her a grateful smile, and he turned to the log burner as Tressa walked out of the front room, through the cavernous kitchen and into the conservatory. She braced herself for the sight that awaited her. As Harry had said, there she was, exactly where she had been left, nestled in her favourite armchair with a patchwork quilt draped over her legs, a gaze fixed on the distant trees at the end of the garden. Crumpled sheets of paper littered the floor around her, evidence of her frenzied scribblings. Kneeling beside Rachel, Tressa tried to bridge the gap that seemed to yawn between them. "Hey, sweetheart," she began softly, reaching out to gently touch Rachel's arm. "What are you drawing there?" Rachel's response was slow, her words weighed down by the fog of medication. "Just things," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced down at the scattered papers, her brow furrowing in frustration. "Trying to make sense, but they keep moving." Tressa nodded sympathetically, though her heart ached at the disconnect between them. "You're doing great, Rachel," she said, her voice infused with reassurance. "I'm proud of you for trying." Rachel's gaze shifted to meet Tressa's, her eyes clouded with confusion. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trailing off into uncertainty. "Because I love you," Tressa replied, her voice catching in her throat. "And I want to understand. Can you tell me what you're drawing?" Rachel hesitated, her thoughts seemingly scattered like the pieces of paper around her. "It's the woods," she murmured finally, her fingers tracing invisible shapes in the air. "But not real, different, weird things hiding." Tressa's heart sank as she watched Rachel struggle to articulate her thoughts. It was like trying to grasp at mist, slipping through her fingers no matter how tightly she clenched. But she refused to give up. "I see," she said gently, offering Rachel a small smile. "You have such a vivid imagination, darling." Rachel's lips twitched in a faint semblance of a smile, but it quickly faded, replaced by a distant look in her eyes. "Just wish they'd stop looking," she murmured, her voice tinged with sadness. Tressa reached out and took Rachel's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "I know, darling," she whispered, her own heart heavy. "But we'll get through this together, okay?" Rachel nodded slowly, her grip tightening on Tressa's hand, the same way it had when it was a few sizes smaller. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the distant whisper of the wind through the trees. Then, quite suddenly, Rachel's gaze fell upon the covered painting, leaning against the wall, her expression a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Tressa felt a pang of surprise. It was rare for Rachel to show any interest in their surroundings, let alone something as mundane as a painting. "It's, something Mrs. Gullis gave us," Tressa explained hesitantly, her voice faltering as she struggled to find the right words. "Remember Mrs. Gullis? She used to babysit you when you were little." Rachel's brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to recall the name. "She, me, and her, the woods," she repeated softly, her voice quiet and unsure. Tressa nodded, hoping to jog Rachel's memory. "Yes, that's right. She gave us this painting." Rachel's gaze remained fixed on the covered canvas, her eyes seeming to bore into it as if trying to see through the covering. Then, without warning, she turned to Tressa with a sudden urgency in her expression. "I need to see it," Rachel declared, her voice surprisingly firm. Tressa's heart skipped a beat at the intensity in Rachel's eyes. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to protect Rachel from whatever lay beneath the sackcloth. She didn't react well to things outside her everyday world, the uncertainty that they portended. But something in Rachel's gaze held her captive, compelling her to comply, the same irresistible something that had gripped her ever since she had taken the painting from the cottage. Wordlessly, Tressa handed the painting to Rachel, her hands trembling slightly. As Rachel pulled off the sackcloth, a heavy silence descended over the room, broken only by the rustle of fabric and the sound of their shallow breaths. Tressa held her breath as Rachel's eyes fell upon the grotesque figure depicted on the canvas. Rachel was perfectly still, her gaze locked on the twisted, flower-faced creature staring back at her. Then, in an instant, recognition flashed across Rachel's eyes, and Tressa felt her heart fall into her stomach. The look of comprehension that crossed Rachel's features sent a wave of dread coursing through Tressa's veins, and she knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that Rachel had seen the face before. Tressa felt like she was falling through the floor, her mind teetering on the edge of something far beyond her understanding, something dark and unfathomable that lurked and coiled and twisted around the animal part of her brain like a strangling root. Rachel's eyes widened, her breaths shallow and erratic. Tressa leaned in, bracing herself for the impending meltdown, but to her astonishment it never came. Instead, Rachel's eyes filled with tears, her face contorting into a mask of despair. She set the painting down with a tenderness that caught Tressa off guard, her usual demeanour replaced by a vulnerability that seemed entirely out of character. Tressa's heart clenched as she watched Rachel sob quietly, her tears streaking down her cheeks in silent agony. It was a sight that pierced Tressa's soul, and for a moment the little girl with the fairy wings was sat in front of her again, sobbing that she'd scraped her knee after falling off the tree she'd climbed. She wondered if she was dreaming, if this surreal scene was nothing more than a figment of her overwrought imagination. But as Rachel's cries filled the air, Tressa snapped out of her daze, gathering her daughter into her arms and holding her close. "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry, it's all right. It's just a painting." She cursed herself for ever bringing the unsettling painting into their home, for allowing anything to disturb the fragile peace they had struggled so hard to maintain. Rachel was her priority. Making her as happy as possible was all that mattered. How many moments had she lost with her daughter because she was busy at work, chasing moments of excitement from overly romantic paintings by long-dead, forgotten artists? "You lied to me," Rachel whispered brokenly, her voice trembling. The words cut through the air like a knife. Tressa's face crumpled with confusion and hurt. "Lied?" she asked, wondering if she'd heard Rachel wrong. "Sweetheart, I wouldn't lie to you. Why would you say that, darling?" Rachel shook her head vehemently, her fear and hurt palpable. She fixed her gaze on the edge of the woods beyond the garden. "You told me he wasn't real!" Rachel wept, her voice cracking with anguish. The accusation hung heavy in the air, suffocating Tressa with a sense of guilt and dread. She opened her mouth to respond, to offer some feeble explanation, but the words stuck in her throat. The profound unease was swilling around her like acid, her thoughts spinning in turmoil. Before she could utter a single word, Harry burst into the room, his face etched with concern. Tressa didn't register exactly what he said as he gathered Rachel in his arms and carried her away to the sanctuary of her room. She was alone in the conservatory now. The rain had started to beat against the glass roof, ricocheting like bullets, filling the space with a deafening wave of white noise that drowned out everything else. Tressa's eyes fell upon one of Rachel's discarded drawings. She reached down and carefully unfolded the crumpled paper. Her breath caught in her throat. The detail was crude, the stick figure drawing childish, but the flower-faced abomination from the painting was unmistakable, peering out from the bushes at the end of the garden. It took hours for them to calm Rachel down and get her to bed. Tressa felt like she was outside her own body the whole time, her usual reassurances to her daughter falling flat. She and Harry were sat in the front room now on separate couches, quilted blankets draped over their shoulders. The log burner roared, casting flickering orange lights across the darkened room. Tressa stared into the flames, the white-hot core of the fire burning a dark smudge at the centre of her vision. She didn't mind. Anything to blot out the face of the fairy king and his obscene flapping petals. Harry gripped onto the painting, studying it intently by the light of the fire. He sighed and set it down, turning it to face the wall so that only the back was visible to them. Tressa glanced up at him, her expression worn with exhaustion and guilt. "You're right," he finally said. Tressa looked up at him. "I'm right?" she asked quietly. "It's by Richard Dad. 1843 by my reckoning. A masterpiece. It's worth a lot of money," Harry stated plainly. Tressa stared down at her feet in shame, feeling utterly worthless. So many things had gone wrong for her today. "I didn't mean to," she muttered limply. Harry sighed. "It's been hard," he began delicately. "I know that it's been hard. All of this. It's not the life I promised you. Not by a country mile. Caring for Rachel is hard. Being just the three of us alone out here, that's hard. Me rotting away. Not being able to help." He stared into the fire, his expression inscrutable. "I haven't spoken to Patrick in 3 years," he confessed quietly. "I only hear from Anthony every now and then. I've never met Patrick's daughter. My own grandchild. I lie awake at night wondering if I ever will. Whether she even knows that I exist." Tressa felt the tears rolling down her cheeks. Harry was usually so quiet and stoic. For him to share his grief at the estrangement from his sons like this made her feel even worse, blaming herself for his pain, for Rachel's pain, for her own pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Harry looked at Tressa with sympathy, his gaze softening with understanding. We owe it to Rachel not to crack up, not to lose ourselves. She needs us to stay in the real world, he said gently. Tressa nodded, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames of the fire. I'll bring the painting back to Mrs. Gullis tomorrow. Tell her the good news, she said flatly. But Harry's response was unexpectedly subdued. He stared into the fire for a long moment, his brow furrowed with concern. Tressa sensed his unease and pressed him gently. What's wrong? She asked, her voice tinged with worry. Harry hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line as he struggled to find the right words. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and cast a solemn look at Tressa. What do you know about Dad? He inquired. Tressa blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in topic. Richard Dad? He was a painter? Part of the class at the Royal Academy? She began slowly, trying to recall what she knew. He painted fairy paintings in incredible detail. Freddie Mercury wrote a song about one of them, the one in the Tate. Harry's expression grew graver, his eyes clouded with concern. And he also lived in Cobham. In fact, he lived in the house where Mrs. Gullis lives now. Tressa felt her stomach twisting with dread. That's probably how the painting ended up there. Dad must have left it in the attic or something, she whispered. Harry buried his face in his hands, his shoulders slumping. Tressa's fear intensified, her voice trembling as she reached out for him. Harry, what's wrong? She asked again, her heart pounding in her chest. Harry looked back up at Tressa, older and greyer than she had ever seen him. When I was a boy, he started slowly, his voice carrying a tremor of unease. Me and my friends would go playing in the woods, like all the children my age did, before everyone got a television. He paused, a nostalgic smile briefly flickering across his face before fading into a solemn expression. Our favourite spot was Hollow Hill. We'd spend hours there, letting our imaginations run riot. Tressa listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. Harry continued, his voice tinged with a sense of urgency. It's an old Bronze Age barrow grave, I know that now, he explained. But I remember Mrs. Gullis's mother clipping me round the ear when I told her we'd been playing there. She scolded me for playing at Hollow Hill. That was where the Fae folk danced, she said. That was where the king under the hill slept. Tressa's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling. Mrs. Gullis's story from earlier echoed in her mind. Rachel ran off. When she came back, she told me that she'd even seen them dancing around Hollow Hill. She felt sick. Harry pressed on with his story, his voice growing darker with each word. I thought it was a silly story, he confessed. The kind parents made up to keep their children from staying out late at night. It wasn't until years later that I found out the truth. The truth? Tressa whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Harry's expression was grim. There were still a few old folks in the village when I was young who remembered it, he recounted. Old Tom Cotton, the blind old man who lived in the cottage next to the Gullis's place, had spun me the whole horrid story one day when I was painting his fences. Tressa leaned in closer, her heart pounding in her ears. Harry continued. When old Tom was a boy, long, long ago, The cottage was home to Robert and Mary Dadd. Robert was the village chemist, the pharmacist, a much respected man. Their son Richard had gone off to London to study art, bigger and better things. He and his wife were very proud of him. Cold sweat was shimmering off Tressa despite the heat. And then one day, May 1843, Harry's voice faltered, a haunted look in his eyes. Richard had returned to Cobham quite suddenly. He had been in Egypt. Harry's voice trembled with uncertainty. Old Tom said that his mother had told him that the heat stroke had sent him silly. Dad was violent, delusional, always muttering darkly. That's what old Tom remembered. His parents didn't understand what had happened to him, what had happened to their bright boy, but they cared for him the best they could. Tressa felt a pang of recognition in Harry's words, her mind flashing back to the countless times she and him had tried to comfort Rachel during her most harrowing episodes. One day in August, Harry's voice faltered, pain etched into his features. The police were all over the cottage, old Tom said. He could still remember it all those years later. Mary Dadd screaming. Tressa's heart was pounding in her ears as she silently willed Harry to continue, even as she wished she didn't have to know what he was going to say. Harry took a deep breath, steeling himself. Richard had taken his father to the woods, and he'd slit his throat with a razor. Tressa gasped in horror, her hands flying to cover her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. The image of Rachel cowering in the bathtub with the knife, the bruises on the man she had assaulted with the motorcycle helmet, the flying fists as her and Harry tried to restrain her, all flashed through her mind with dreadful clarity. They found Robert's body on top of Hollow Hill, Harry continued. The flowers drenched in his blood. Tressa was sobbing, her heart breaking at the thought of the unspeakable tragedy that had unfolded so many years ago. Richard tried to run to France, Harry continued, but they caught him, and he spent the rest of his days in Broadmoor Asylum. He kept painting pictures of the fairies. The fairy fella's master stroke took him 10 years, and he never finished it. A paranoid schizophrenic, that's what experts think now. He thought his father was the devil, and that he was under the control of a god. The king under the hill had told him to do it. Tressa's mind reeled with the enormity of it all, the sheer horror of Richard Dadd's descent into madness sending her into a panic. She leapt to her feet. "Rachel!" she wept, her voice choked with grief. "He's going to get Rachel too!" The crash echoed through the house like a bomb going off. Harry and Tressa leapt up out of their chairs, the sound of shattering glass piercing through the roaring wind. Their eyes met in a panic-stricken exchange. "Pixie!" Harry shouted. Without hesitation they bolted, their instincts driving them forward. Bursting through the lounge door, they were met with a sight of chaos. The kitchen was engulfed in the deafening roar of the storm. The door leading out of the conservatory smashed open, the wind howling its fury. Harry raced upstairs, calling out Rachel's name in desperation. Tressa stood, frozen in horror, her gaze fixated on the trail of bloody droplets leading from the shattered door and into the darkness of the garden. Dread washed over her as her mind connected the whole terrible tableau together. Harry's footsteps echoed back down the stairs, his face pale with fear as he reached the bottom, his chest heaving with exertion. "She's not in her bed!" he exclaimed, his voice trembling with panic. Tressa's mind raced as she jammed on her Wellington boots and grabbed her coat, her movements swift and determined. "I'm going after her!" she yelled over the howling wind, stuffing a vial of antipsychotics into her pocket. "Call the police and an ambulance! Do it, Harry!" Before he could respond, Tressa had disappeared into the maelstrom outside, her figure swallowed by the darkness in an instant. Alone in the kitchen, Harry's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his heart pounding in his ears. As he grabbed it from the kitchen worktop, he froze to the spot. A knife was missing from the wooden block. Tressa fought through the dense undergrowth of the woods, her body buffeted by the relentless onslaught of rain. The storm lashed at her, tearing leaves and bark from the trees, blinding her with its ferocity. "Rachel!" she cried out, her voice lost amidst the howling wind. Her phone's feeble light offered little assistance in the enveloping darkness. She stuffed it back in her pocket and groped blindly through the tangled forest. Her thoughts swirled in a tumult of fear and desperation. Richard Dad, the thing in the painting, old blind Tom peering through the fence, Rachel red in the face, blaming the naughty fairies, Harry's smile the first time they met, Rachel in the bathtub, her parents. How long since she had even spoken to them? "I'm sorry!" she shrieked with a choked sob. "I'm so sorry!" The tempest drowned out all words. There were other noises now. Strange noises, assailing her senses. Someone, something, was giggling, just outside the limits of the audible spectrum. The laughter seemed to dance on the edge of sanity. Tressa screamed Rachel's name into the abyss. Something brushed against her leg, a flurry of unseen movements. She kicked at the dozens of scampering, unseen somethings and stumbled disorientated over a hidden branch, tumbling uncontrollably down the muddy embankment. She fell, head over heels, over and over again until she landed in a heap at the bottom, her body racked with sobs as she lay amid the cold, unforgiving earth. She wanted it to swallow it up. She wanted oblivion, to cease to exist. The whole forest bristled with laughter at her caprice and her lies and her failures. Tressa pulled herself up from the mire, crouching on her haunches like an animal, her movements slow and laboured. She looked up and took in the sight before her. Hollow Hill was bathed in the moonlight. The flowers twinkled the ancient mound like 100,000 unseeing faces. At the base of the heap lay Rachel, her form bathed in the eerie glow, her clothes stained crimson with blood. In her trembling hands glinted the knife. Tressa sobbed and wailed, staggering forward, crawling through the muck towards her daughter. Rachel was gibbering in despair. "Lie to me, he sees the hell, he sleeps, I don't want to, make me, lie to me, he's here." Her words were a jumbled cacophony of delusion and distress. Tressa's own tears mingled with the mud as she neared her daughter, every inch crossed in agony. After an age, she reached Rachel's side. Her daughter's face contorted in rage. "Lie to me!" she yelled into the wind. "You looked at him! You know his face too! He hates you! He wants you dead!" Tressa ignored the knife. She let the small orange vial drop from her hand as she enveloped Rachel in a tender embrace. "My brave girl," she whispered into her ear. I know he's here. You're not alone, sweetheart. I won't let him hurt you. Let's look at him, sweetheart. Let's look at him together." With a clatter, the knife slipped from Rachel's grasp. She clung on to Tressa with an intensity fiercer than she had ever felt before. "He's beautiful, Mom!" wailed Rachel. "He's so beautiful!" The two of them turned to face Hollow Hill. Shimmering gaily under the light of the moon, Tressa had to agree with her daughter, as she felt the last shreds of her sanity fall away, and heard the sirens wail in the far distance beyond the trees. Dad's painting really hadn't done justice to the thing she saw perching on top of the heap. They Have Faces Like Flowers was written and performed by Isaac Hart. The music was by Kevin MacLeod. The script editor was Jennifer Rianne Bartley. Ghost in the Museum will return with a new story on the 27th of May. Thank you for listening. May we meet again.